everyone, welcome to another category video, and today we'll be going over video cards, and Paul will be enlightening us on the ins and outs from video cards, old to new and everything in between. So let's get started.
All right.
So what exactly is a video card and what does it do?
Well, that's a very complex question, Joanne, so I will give you a very simple answer. But basically, when it comes to what happens inside your computer to what you see on your screen, that is the interchange that the video card handles. So the video card is basically taking all those bits of data, translating it into a viewable image on your screen, and there's a lot of different varying levels of doing that. And what we're talking about a lot today, since this is a video card category video, is going to be more specifically towards discrete, what is known as discrete graphics cards. So all these ones that we see out here in front of us, which are an independent item that you buy and add onto your computer. But these actually represent a smaller portion of the market when it comes to video cards, because there's lots of computers out there that people don't necessarily use to play video games on. Whereas 3D rendering, which is what these cards are really good at, is great for video games, as well as some other stuff. We're going to talk about workstation cards over there as well. What most people do with computers from a day-to-day perspective, if you're using a computer at work or something, is going to be mostly internet browsing, maybe watching some videos. And those types of tasks are much more simple and much more easy for a video card to handle. So what we actually have back here are a couple CPUs, and both of these CPUs actually have video integrated into them. So it's not necessarily a video card because it's not a separate card with a PCB that you drop into your computer, but these do have essentially a video card integrated into them, and to that end it is usually referred to as an iGPU or an integrated GPU that's part of your CPU. Intel, for right now, has them on their mainstream line, but bear in mind that Intel's Enthusiast platform does not have an iGPU. You will need a separate discrete graphics card for that. AMD is currently calling their CPUs with the graphics integrated an APU, or an accelerated processing unit. So that's available from both sides of the CPU camp.
Oh, okay. So let me get this straight. So there are discrete graphics,
yes,
which is a card hardware by itself, and then there's integrated graphics with the GPU built onto the CPU.
Correct.
So do you need a specific socket type in order to be able to install these integrated graphics cards?
Definitely, and this is a point where you guys can go and reference. We've done so far a couple different videos, one on CPUs specifically. We've also done a video on motherboards specifically, so if you guys want to take a look at those, you might be able to find out a little bit more information on choosing the specific one that's going to fit your needs. But a couple things to bear in mind is, first off, on the CPU side, there's basically two main players when it comes to desktop processors. That would be AMD, of course, as well as Intel. Now there's a little bit of confusion that's come into play because AMD not only makes processors, but AMD also makes graphics cards. So some of the AMD cards that you see out there, so there's some crossover. These cards actually, before AMD started doing graphics cards, was called ATI. AMD acquired ATI, and now AMD makes both. And then from Intel's side, of course, for quite a few generations now, they've also been integrating graphics onto the CPU. So basically right now for Intel, the sockets that have integrated GPUs would be anything that's socket 1156, which goes back to I think about 2010, 1155, which came out in 2011, and then 1150, which just came out just this past year.
Oh, that's for the the Haswell, correct?
Yes, for Haswell. So if you're buying a mainstream processor from Intel, it will include an iGPU in the vast majority of cases. There are one or two little processors that actually sell that don't have it, so keep your eye out for those, but usually it'll specify it very clearly, graphics not included. And then for AMD, as long as you're buying one of their APUs, then it will have graphics integrated there as well. And then as mentioned with Intel, there's a few different sockets that are currently out and viable that you can get processors for. The same thing goes for AMD with their APUs. They have the FM1 socket, which is the first generation of their APUs, and then now they also have FM2 and FM2 Plus. So again, we dealt with that a little bit more in our motherboard category video, but just make sure whatever your APU you're getting is the same socket compatibility as your motherboard. And if you're not 100% sure, double check your motherboard's manufacturer's website, because they will have a CPU compatibility list, and you can make sure that that's all going to fit together. So if you're going to go the iGPU route or the APU route, I guess both of them have integrated GPUs, you of course will need to connect your computer to your monitor in order to send a signal over there. So your motherboard, if it has an iGPU, will also have video outs on the back. So this motherboard that we're looking at here first is an Intel motherboard. It's a Z87 socket. This is going to support your Haswell CPUs. And at the back here we have some video outs. So basically, with the processor installed, you simply connect your monitor to these ports here at the back, and that will give you the connectivity that you desire. So this one has actually a dual link DVI. This one has a HDMI down at the bottom. It has a full-size DisplayPort, and then another HDMI that's also available right there. So simply connect those up, and in just a few moments I'm going to talk more specifically about the vagaries of those connection standards. Of course, it's not just AMD, but also, I'm sorry, not just Intel, but also AMD has APUs. So again, this one is an FM2 socket motherboard. This is an A88X chipset from Gigabyte, and again here we've got video outs on the motherboard. So we have a 15-pin D-sub connector right there, so that's for an analog VGA connection. You've got your dual link DVI again, and then you have an HDMI, which is located right there.
So what I want to know is, so we have the discrete graphics cards, and the high-end ones are great for gaming. So I'm wondering, with an APU, iGPU, is it also good for like BF4, you know, the higher-end games with like more intensive graphics?
Not always, and there's going to be some trade-off there. When it comes to graphics, there's a lot of different variables that go into how well your graphics card or integrated graphics is going to be able to render something specific, and definitely specifically if it's 3D rendering, because that is much more taxing again for the graphics card than it is just simple web page browsing or something like that. So the integrated graphics for these types of processors, probably not ideal for gaming, although you can do some gaming. The newest and best games like Battlefield 4, for example, that you mentioned, which are really graphically intensive, and you're dealing with tons and tons of pixels and tons of polygons and lots of different post-processing effects and that sort of thing. Chances are, if you try to run something like that on one of these APUs or integrated GPUs, and especially if you're playing at a reasonable resolution like 1920 by 1080 or above, these are not going to perform very well. If you're talking about games that are maybe a bit more simpler, you know, for instance, let's say Blizzard, for example, when they design games, they typically design them not to necessarily be on the cutting edge of graphics processing, but they design them to be a bit more accessible for lots of different people. So there's going to be some give and take, so it's recommended to check out whatever APU or integrated GPU you might be looking at. Look online to find other people who have gotten that, tried out the games that you might want to play, and that will give you a better idea of whether you can rely on the integrated GPU or whether you want to go with something discrete. But generally speaking, if you are planning on building a PC gaming system, you're going to want a discrete graphics card, because the difference jumping from here to here is pretty big. And then again, especially if you're playing at a high resolution, because 1080 is pretty much the standard for PC gaming these days.
So, you know, since we're talking about gaming, why don't we just go straight into Crossfire setups, SLI, you know, the multi-card setups, the benefits, you know, how you do it, and just everything about it.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually, well, can we talk about one other thing first real quick?
Yeah.
Okay. I have been saving graphics cards because I like to hoard stuff.
You're older, that's true.
So yeah, I wanted to give you guys a quick history lesson, because when it comes to these discrete graphics cards out here, these of course need to connect to your motherboard to allow everything to play together. And there have been different standards for that over the years, so hopefully this will be a brief jog into history rather than confusing anybody. But if you go back quite a while, when they actually first started coming out with graphics cards, there was no dedicated port on the motherboard to plug them into. And especially with graphics cards, when you're dealing with a lot of data traveling from the graphics card to the CPU and back, it needs a lot of bandwidth. So many years ago, they came out with what is known as AGP. This is actually an AGP card right here. So you might notice the plug down here at the bottom, distinctly different from, for instance, your PCI or your PCI Express expansion cards that you might have seen if you've built any computer within the past 3 or 4 years. AGP had a really nice run for quite a while. It was eventually replaced, and basically, if you're running an AGP graphics card right now, you're pretty out of date.
So when were they made? When were they popular? Like,
that's a good question, which I couldn't say immediately off the top of my head, but I want to say 2005-ish.
Yeah?
2004, 2005, 2006 was probably when they started phasing it out. Anytime you have a standard that's been around for a while, it takes a while to phase it out of the PC space. So for a while you had motherboards that had both AGP and PCI Express on them, so it would give you the option to go with either. But this was a dedicated port. There were no other expansion cards for the most part that could plug into an AGP port. It was just for graphics, and it was very, very helpful for PC gamers in particular because it allowed graphics cards manufacturers, such as NVIDIA and ATI at the time, to really ramp up the amount of power that the GPU had because they had so much more bandwidth to work with. Of course, by today's standards, it's pretty minimal, but again, it's a good way to look and tell if you really need to update your computer. If it's still running AGP, it's pretty out of date. Also, if you are more detail-oriented people have noticed, this AGP graphics card is so old that the caps have actually exploded on it.
Yeah, look at that.
That means that this card will never work again, at least not without replacing those caps. And
what material is the heatsink, by the way?
I believe this is an aluminum heatsink, although it's difficult to say for sure. Yeah, that feels like aluminum.
So it's not copper.
Not copper, but you bring up a good point. We're going to move on to that one in just a moment, but I have one in between here. This is a PCI graphics card. So the connector down at the bottom, standard PCI. PCI is becoming more and more legacy, although even the newest motherboards that are coming out right now from AMD and Intel do often have PCI slots on them. So an older PCI card you can still drop into there. These were never gaming powerhouse cards, but they were very flexible. So for example, if you had a motherboard with an AGP port on it and a graphics card in there, and you wanted to add another graphics card, which was popular for a while depending on your use case scenario, PCI would give you that option. So there's still PCI cards floating around out there, and for general use computing, they can still do a fine job. And here I will also point out there's an ATI logo. So again, ATI is the graphics or GPU company that was bought up by AMD a few years back. So ATI and AMD are now somewhat synonymous, particularly if you're talking about graphics. So there's a PCI one. And now we move to the current generation interface, although this is a slightly older card again, since you can see it's still ATI. But this is PCI Express. This is the current standard for the interface, and PCI Express has gone through several revisions. There was revision 1, there was also PCI Express Gen 2 and 2.1, which was a follow-up to that, which you will find on most computers that were built in the past 3-4 years. And then more recently, you have PCI Express Gen 3. Physically, the plugs are all the same on them, and they are backwards compatible, so you could take a PCI Express Gen 3 card, for example, and plug it into a PCI Express Gen 2 slot.
So they are all backwards compatible?
They're all,
it's PCI 3?
They're all backwards compatible, but the newest PCI Express Gen 3 cards, for example, you would not want to plug in a PCI Express Gen 1 slot. Not that it wouldn't work, but you would be limiting the bandwidth because as those new versions have come out, it's given you more bandwidth, and more bandwidth is of course necessary for more pixels and more data to be transferred between the GPU and the processor.
So I've noticed that there's quite a bit of copper on there for cooling.
Yes, Joanne, that's another very astute point here. So all graphics cards are going to have some sort of heat sink because they tend to get quite hot, and we'll be dealing with several today which are pretty expansive. This is a single slot card, so you'll notice that thickness-wise it is not very thick. For high-end graphics cards these days, they will often, or pretty much always at least, be a dual slot, and they'll take up 2 slots from your motherboard. But this is a slightly older card, so it didn't need quite as much cooling. But then the other, this is just sort of a little tidbit of info. You'll see all the copper on this heatsink right here, all along the edge. The entire heatsink is actually made all of copper. This was an indication that this card was produced prior to 2008 or so, when the kind of global economy crashed and the prices of metals went through the roof. at that point, the companies realized that it wasn't quite as cost effective to make everything out of all copper, even though it's a very, very effective at dissipating the heat. So post 2008 or so, you will find much more aluminum used in the heat sinks. But that's
yeah,
just...
I've noticed that most of it is aluminum with a bit of copper.
Yeah,
base.
so sometimes you'll have a copper base plates, or you'll have copper heat pipes that make direct contact with the GPU. It's a very effective way for cooling GPUs these days. But usually the thin array that handles most of the heat dissipation is going to be aluminum. But that's just a cost-saving measure by the companies because copper is much more expensive than it used to be. But that's a little bit off topic.
So is gold, huh?
Gold, yes, gold too. we could get into an entire discussion about that.
Next episode.
Yes, exactly. But all right, so talking about discrete graphics cards, again, we have basically two companies that produce the GPUs in those graphics cards. That would be NVIDIA and AMD. AMD, again, also makes the processors, so try not to get that confused. And then when it comes to NVIDIA and AMD, whenever they produce a new GPU, they'll often produce that GPU and they'll have a bunch of different versions of it, and that's how you'll get sort of the different tiers of pricing. So
like a series.
yeah, a different series of pricing. So for instance, NVIDIA is currently working with the 700 series. So for the 700 series, you have the 780 Ti, the 780, we'll go down the list, 780 Ti, 780, 770, and 760. And those will all be more and more expensive as you go up the line, and they'll also perform more and more better.
Would it be
as you
like
go up the
a
line.
big difference in performance, or just?
Yes and no. I mean, it's hard to say specifically. There's always going to be improvement, or there should always be improvement if you go up to a higher tier of GPU. But it's going to depend what game you're playing. It's going to depend what platform you're on. It's going to depend what resolution you're playing at. It's going to depend whether you're using post-processing effects with the game, such as anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering, for example. But basically, yes, you will experience an improvement if you buy a more expensive graphics card.
That's given,
And the best way to get a more definite answer for that question would be to look at benchmarks that are available online. There's tons of websites that do benchmarks. Look up your favorite game. Look up the different graphics cards, see what type of frame rate they get. And bear in mind that if you're looking at frame rate comparisons, because that's typically how graphics cards are measured, how quickly they can refresh each frame in a 3D game that they're playing, bear in mind that you can't always compare those measurements, say, from different websites to each other, because if there's different settings that they might be using, they might not always line up. But if you're looking at, say, a roundup on a specific website, usually they'll be using all the same settings, and that gives you a bit more better direct comparison between the cards.
Okay, so maybe this could be in a different video, but I was just wondering, like, what card would be best at which price point?
Oh, that's definitely the question for another video. This is actually more the domain of the reviewers. We don't do a lot of reviews here at Newegg.com. We try to provide as much information as possible, but when it comes to actually passing judgment on cards, we leave that to the review websites. So there's lots of varying opinions, and it will range everywhere from how a specific card performs at a specific task, to how much heat a card outputs, to how much power a card draws. So there's different variables in there, and different people might say that one task is better than others. Some folks might say, I don't care how hot the card runs or how much power it draws. All I care is about that frame rate that it's able to output. I want to be able to play Battlefield 4 at 60 frames per second minimum. Whereas other people will take a more general perspective and say, well, this does decent at frame rates, but it also has really low power consumption and really low heat. So those are all elements to bear in mind. And definitely there's no shortage of review websites out there, so I would direct you guys over to those to get some more use case scenarios and more opinions on specifically comparing cards to one another.
So basically, do your research.
Yes.
And watch our videos.
Of course, definitely.
But moving right along, you were going down the line of the oldest to the newest.
Yes, so oldest to newest. I'm actually, I'm going to set these aside for now since we've talked about them, and none of them are really very functional anymore anyway. They're just my little museum pieces. So let's talk about, we mentioned AMD and NVIDIA.
Yes.
We mentioned NVIDIA, which is currently now on the 700 series of graphics cards. NVIDIA's GPU line, by the way, is called GeForce. So NVIDIA is the large company. NVIDIA makes lots of stuff, like they make little SoC chips for tablets and a bunch of stuff like that. But NVIDIA's graphics card segment is called GeForce, G-E-F-O-R-C-E. And like you can see right here, GeForce. And then beyond that, you'll have the actual lineup of cards, so GeForce, and then you have the GTX 700 series. There's also the GTX 600 series, which was last generation, but 600 series is still hanging around on the lower tier of cards. So if you're looking for a more cost-effective solution, you can find those. Excuse me. When it comes to AMD, AMD is currently working with the new series of cards. They've actually completely changed their naming convention for the cards. So AMD is currently categorizing their desktop cards as R9 and R7 series.
That's right. I've noticed. I'm like, that's so different. Usually I don't
So
see
yeah,
that.
the R in there refers to Radeon because AMD's graphics cards are called Radeon. So you have AMD R9 cards. So if you see R9, that means it's going to be in the upper tier of graphics cards. R7 cards are going to be more more budget conscious, more you know, more entry level cards. So towards the lower end. And then after R9, you'll find another number. You'll find 290X, 290, 280, 270, and on down the line. So
and 290, of course, is the highest.
Yes, so 290, generally speaking, they go with higher numbers for higher performing cards. So that's kind of a general perspective on the naming convention for right now. And if you're watching this video sometime in the future, there will be more cards coming out. We're never sure what they're going to do with the naming convention. AMD's last series of cards, for instance, was a 7000 series, so everyone was expecting the 8000 series or the
like
9000 series. Like the 7970, for example. We actually have a 7990 right over here. We're going to come back to that,
nice.
Which is still a 7000 series card, which is still a very, very nice performing card. But let's not get too far off topic there.
You were saying about...
So, yes, so once a graphics card company designs a GPU, they will typically do what is called a reference design. Because whereas I've told you guys that there are two GPU companies, NVIDIA and AMD, you might notice if you're looking at, for instance, this pile of boxes over here, these are not all NVIDIA and AMD solely cards. So for instance, this is an MSI card, this is an ASUS card, that's an EVGA, that's an HIS. Gigabyte makes cards as well. There's lots of companies that make graphics cards. Those companies don't make the GPUs. So that's another area where there's a bit of confusion if you're coming into this without any prior knowledge. So just bear in mind, you might have an ASUS AMD card, you might have an ASUS NVIDIA card. There's some video card manufacturers that work solely with one company or another. Sometimes that changes, but basically NVIDIA and AMD make the GPU in the card, and then these companies will either manufacture the rest of the card, or they'll simply provide the distribution and the support for the card.
Okay, so for reference cards, the GPU and the PCB and everything on there, that's just what it is. But then, like, what other companies do is they add a custom cooler, right?
Yes.
But some of them sometimes change the PCB layout.
They can. So there's that is where you make the transition from what is known as the reference design to a custom design. So for an example of that, I have these two GTX 780 cards right here. So this, first off, is NVIDIA's reference design for the GTX 780. So NVIDIA designed this card, and NVIDIA manufactured this card. However, you could not necessarily purchase this card directly from NVIDIA. You would need to purchase this from one of their board partners. Now, that's not to say that you can't get a card that looks exactly like this, but if you buy a GTX 780 reference design, it will look exactly like this, except every once in a while the board manufacturers will put some stickers on there or something like that to distinguish it a little bit more. But that's another important element. You have the PCB here on the back, and that is kind of like the motherboard. It ties everything together for the graphics card. The GPU, you can usually tell by where it's mounted, which is right there at the center, although the GPU itself is on the other side of this graphics card. And then you have the PCB layout here, which is designed to provide areas for the memory to go, for the power delivery components to deliver power to the GPU, and to keep everything connected as well as cooled off, of course. And then on the other side of the card, we have the cooling solution. So this is what is known as a blower style fan right down here on this end. and then you'll have the aluminum fin stack, which you can see right there through that little window. And then you also have, of course, the housing, and then NVIDIA has decided to go with an all-metal housing for their design on the GTX 780. And then down at this end, you have the video outs. Now, these are all elements that most graphics cards manufacturers can change if they want to go through the process of redesigning and manufacturing their own version of the card. Now, you might have different elements of the card that manufacturers decide to change. So, for example, the most common thing that you'll see, I think, when it comes to third-party designs for graphics cards is they'll use the same PCB layout on the bottom, because that takes quite a bit of engineering skill to develop your own. But they'll take the top of the card, the cooling solution, they'll remove that, and they'll basically design their own and plop it on the top there. Now, that's not necessarily to say that there's anything wrong with this NVIDIA design, but different card manufacturers say, well, we want to go a different route. So one example here is that this is an enclosed design. You can see there's not much space here along the card for any air to escape. That means that the air is going to be pushed out the back of your computer because it's primarily going to be exhausting out the slots at the back that you can see there. But it does mean that these enclosed designs, typically the GPU might run a little bit warmer than it will with, say, this design from EVGA, which is EVGA's ACX cooler. So for this design, you can see that EVGA has a completely different looking cooler on the top. It has 2 fans instead of 1, but that's a different style of fan. The one on the NVIDIA reference design is a blower style fan, and these are more traditional style fans. These are going to be blowing air downward over the aluminum fins that you can see beneath there. And then also all along the sides it is open, which means that there's plenty of room for the air to escape, which means that it's going to be very effective at cooling. However, the downside to that is that this air is going to be pushed out into your case.
Ooh,
So that is something to consider. If you're going for an open style cooler like this, it can lead to lower GPU temperatures, and this varies, of course, depending on the design and everything. But it's often good to consider that you might want to make sure that you have plenty of airflow in your case. So if you're going for an all-silent solution or something, and your case doesn't have a whole lot of fans, this might not be the best option for you. So again, that's just a matter of preference, and it's something that a little bit of research depending on the style of case, the style of graphics card, and of course the overall power of your computer. Because again, the GPU is often the element of a gaming PC that generates the most heat. So it's important to make sure that you have solutions in place to dissipate that heat and make sure that all the components in your computer can run at the same speed.
Okay, so I have a question. So I've noticed that on some of the cards there are these screws that you can remove the cooler. So what would be the reason for removing the cooler?
There's different reasons for that, but very good question. Lots of screws on this one, for example. So removing the cooler can offer you a couple different things. The most simple and straightforward one would be to clean it, because graphics cards do build up some dust over time. So if you use this for 6 months or a year, you're probably going to have some dust over the aluminum fins on the bottom. If you use it for a very long time, or if you have your computer on the floor, for example, you might have dust buildup that can get really bad really fast. That can impede the airflow over the fins, which means that the GPU is going to run hotter. And that also means that you might not be able to run it at its max frequency, for example, so it can affect the performance of your system. Removing the GPU, or removing the shroud and the heatsink, can allow you to clean that out, which is a pretty practical means of doing that. But bear in mind that just as when you install a CPU onto a motherboard, there is some thermal paste on there that helps provide contact between the GPU and the cooling solution. So you might need to clean that and replace it, for example.
Okay.
But that would be a different video tutorial, I think, for this one. But then the other reason why you might want to remove the cooler would be to go with your own cooling solution. There are third-party manufacturers that make cooling solutions specifically for graphics cards, so you can buy them and install your own if you want some enhanced cooling, or if you want to get something that's really huge to provide additional heat dissipation so you can get more of an overclock, or if you're an extreme enthusiast, in which case you're probably watching this video just for fun because you probably know all this stuff already. You might remove that shroud so that you can pop a water block onto this if you're doing a custom water-cooled solution, which is very popular and which is how you can get really the most performance out of your graphics card, because you can overclock more if you're keeping the card cooler and keeping the GPU cooler. So there's an example of a reference design card right next to a custom design card, and you can see they look quite different on the face of it, but effectively they have the same GPU at their heart. And apart from many overclocking benefits you get out of this card, they're going to run at the same speed out of the box. But overclocking is a way that you can basically push the card a little bit farther and get additional performance. The other element, of course, would be the PCB, and this is another thing that some manufacturers will dive into. Apart from designing a specific cooler, they might design an entire custom designed PCB to move some of the elements around or to make it line up with their specific cooler a bit better. But again, that will vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, and definitely which card that you're looking at. And I have one that we're going to look at in a second, which is a very unique design by a graphics card manufacturer, not AMD or NVIDIA.
Okay, so before we move forward with, I'm not sure if you're going to go over the dual card setup and the multi-card setup, but could we possibly go over some of the ports on the back?
Yes.
Like what they connect to? And
that's a very good idea, Joanne, because that's one of the simpler things. So if you've watched this far and you've been confused, hopefully this will help clarify some stuff for you. Ports on the back of a graphics card is, of course, that physical connection from your computer or your desktop over to your monitor. There's different ports that work in different ways. Some are better than others. I can say that without hesitation. And making sure that your graphics card has the correct ports to connect to your monitor is pretty important.
Very important, yes.
Let's start out just by taking a closer look at this GTX 780 right here. And for example, you will notice that this graphics card has 4 video outs, and these are all video outs. If you have a video in, that's pretty rare, but your graphics card should tell you that. Actually, that's really rare these days to have a video in on a graphics card. So first off, over on this side, you have a couple DVI ports. DVI, when it comes to PCs, is probably the most prevalent connection that's currently around. It's been around for quite some time. It's everywhere, and chances are, if you have a graphics card or a monitor, that it's got at least one DVI connector on there. Something to keep in mind for DVI is that there's actually several different connection points on here. So you have the big grid of squares that's on the left side of that plug right there. Those are the digital data connection points. And there's actually a couple different standards. There's what is known as single link and what is known as dual link. Yes. These are both dual link. If you have single link, then basically the connections right at the center there, the center 3 rows or so of blocks will not have pins in them. Another thing is that you actually have analog connections built into a DVI connector as well. So over on this side you see that straight line. This top port is actually DVI digital only, so that straight line is basically just there to help you line up the connector. This connection only has digital. The one on the bottom here, however, has digital and analog, so you'll see the little plus sign on the right side of the plug. And that is basically only for the analog connections. And all that means is that with these 2 DVI ports, the one on the bottom, you could use a DVI to VGA adapter because it will also push an analog signal as well as digital. Generally speaking, if you're buying a new computer or a new monitor or something like that, you want to stick with digital. It's much more universal. VGA is slightly older, but if you have an older monitor that you want to keep using, it is important to make sure that you have that analog connection available. Speaking of analog, let's bring this one over here and set it right on top. This is another video card, and if you're wondering what an analog connector looks like, it's this blue one right here. Also, for color coding, DVI is often white. VGA is often blue. So VGA is the analog connection standard, and this port right here is actually a D-sub port. The D is because it's D-shaped, and sub stands for sub-miniature. That's a 15-pin D-sub right there. D-sub is actually used as a connection standard. It's been used as a connection standard with computers for quite some time now. So there's other types of connections that use D-sub ports, but typically if you see a 15-pin D-sub that's blue, it means it's a analog VGA connection for a video. And then apart from VGA and DVI, you've got a couple more that are down here. And these are full-size ports. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Sometimes you'll have full-size, sometimes you'll have smaller ones. But that's HDMI right there on the lower right. And HDMI, if you have set up a home theater, you might recognize. HDMI has been around for quite some time. There's different standards. 1.4 is Yes, there's 1.4, there's 1.4a. That's actually would be another good topic for a completely different video, is all the different HDMI standards. But basically, HDMI 1.4 is around right now. It can handle up to 1080 resolution, or 1920 by 1080 is the full resolution there. And the nice thing about the nice thing about HDMI is it provides both that digital video signal connection as well as sound.
Audio, that's
audio
right,
as well. So one plug gets you both your video and your audio, which is pretty nice. That also means, by the way, if you have a graphics card with an HDMI on there, it also means that there's a sound chip on this graphics card, which I didn't know for quite some time. But that's yeah. So when you install a graphics card, you'll often, when you're installing the drivers, see it recognize an audio device as well as a video device, and that's basically recognizing the audio device that's going to be pushing audio out of that HDMI port.
Oh, that's new.
Newer HDMI standards are going to be supporting stuff like 4K resolutions. That's really not that prevalent right now, although it will be in the future. And definitely pay attention to your HDMI connectors, because, for example, on the current generation of consoles, the ones that just came out, like Xbox One and PlayStation 4, they have HDMI connectors, and they can support 4K resolution. However, currently HDMI will cap your frame rate. So you can't get higher than 30 frames per second.
That's it?
So specifically for PC gamers who are much more accustomed to 60 frames per second or better, that can be a limiting factor. It's definitely a limiting factor of the consoles, but that's one of the reasons why PC gamers like to say that we can game at higher resolutions and higher frame rates than the consoles, and that is one definite specific reason why is right there, simply because of the connection standard. Lastly, over on this side you have DisplayPort. That is also a full-size DisplayPort connector. You'll often see mini DisplayPort on some devices as well, which, nope, not that one.
So about DisplayPort.
Oh, here's some DisplayPorts. All right, so
those are the mini
those
ones.
are mini DisplayPorts. So if you get something, so again, these little ones right here are the same as this one down here. It's just that's a mini on top, and this is full size on the bottom. DisplayPort is currently my favorite connection standard because it provides tons and tons of bandwidth. If, for example, you want to plug in a monitor that's higher resolution than 1080, so if you wanted to do something like Kyle just got a 2560 by 1440 monitor. There's also 2560 by 1600, and then of course 4K, which is on the horizon. So it's starting to gain adoption more and more. But if you want real 4K, right now there's pretty much DisplayPort is the only thing that you can connect that will do both 4K resolution as well as a high refresh rate. Standards for connecting monitors to 4K monitors through DVI, for example, right now are monitors that are actually using two panels connected together, and then the DVI basically looks at it like two different monitors. But we're seeing, again, more 4K adoption rates, so we're going to be seeing those standards improved. We're going to be seeing, hopefully, prices come down for 4K monitors and televisions. And we'll also be seeing improvements in the actual interconnects so that we can get the amount of bandwidth that we need to see high refresh rate 4K images.
Okay, so if you're looking to push 4K, you would probably go with a DisplayPort, right?
Probably go with DisplayPorts. That's probably another good topic for another video, is 4K adoption right now, because it's really something that's is on the high end for people who are looking at improving. I know a lot of people have really just jumped onto 1080, so 4K might be a big jump beyond that. But again, just make sure that your graphics card is a high-end graphics card if you're going to go with 4K, because if you're gaming at that resolution, it's 4 times the amount of pixels as 1080.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it basically will bring any even highest-end graphics card to its knees, which is a great reason for doing something like an SLI or a Crossfire configuration.
And also, when you get like the mini ports on the back of your cards, you'll probably need some kind of adapter, right, to be able to plug in your monitor. So
yeah, that's something that some graphics cards will come with, little adapters. Other times, you might need to spend a few extra bucks to get an adapter so that you can route the cable over to your monitor or just plug it into the back of your graphics card. But let's talk a little bit more about using multiple graphics cards.
All right, let's go on to how you do multi-card setups and what are the benefits and all that good stuff.
Okay, so multi-graphics card solutions, and if you watch Newegg TV, you might have seen quite a few of our videos where we do crazy 3- and 4-way Crossfire or SLI configurations. Let's start from the basics though. If you don't know what Crossfire or SLI is, if you have one graphics card, it should be able to perform as good as one graphics card can. But NVIDIA and ATI originally, now AMD, decided, well, if we can get a lot of performance with one graphics card, what if we could use 2 graphics cards?
Oh my God, brilliant.
Yes. So they basically devised some methods which have been refined over time to take more than one graphics card, add them into your computer, and gets a cumulative performance. Now, that's not necessarily to say that the performance is linear, which means if one graphics card can get you 100 frames per second in a game, and you add a second graphics card, it's not going to jump up to 200 frames per second. You're going to have diminishing returns to some extent. So when people ask me about multi-card configurations, basically what I say is if you're buying new parts, look for the best performing single graphics card that you can. If, as you're looking for that card, you find that you're getting towards the top tiers of graphics cards that are currently available, like a 780 or 780 Ti for NVIDIA, or a 290 or a 290X for AMD right now, and you find that you still need more performance if you're going with one of those high-resolution displays or something like that, then consider adding a second card, because while it does increase performance, there are sometimes compatibility issues that can come into play, and not all games can take advantage of 2 graphics cards. But it is a really good way to give yourself more performance than is currently available with the highest of the high-end graphics cards that are currently on the market. So again, for early adopters, for enthusiasts, for people who are already jumping onto the 4K bandwagon because they have lots of money or something like that, it's a great solution to really bring your computer to the maximum amount of performance that's possible. Now, one clarification that I wanted to make here when it comes to Crossfire or SLI configurations, again, Crossfire for AMD, SLI for NVIDIA, they have their different naming conventions for both of them. If you have a single card, you have a single card. If you have 2 graphics cards, each with a single GPU, then that is 2-way. If you have 3, that is 3-way SLI or Crossfire. If you have 4, that is 4-way SLI or Crossfire X. But both companies make graphics cards that have more than one GPU on them. So this is basically like a Crossfire solution in a single graphics card. This is AMD's Radeon 7990. And this one basically has 2 7970 GPUs on the same card. So you can see the 2 brackets at the back. There's a single distinct GPU underneath each one of those graphics, or underneath each one of those brackets. This card is basically giving you 2-way Crossfire in one card. So you could take 2 of these cards and put them together and give yourself 4 GPUs, which is the max. So there's no going beyond 4 GPUs right now unless you're in the workstation space. But basically, if you have 2 of these 2 GPU cards, you give yourself 4 GPUs. But that is not 4-way. 4-way is 4 distinct cards with single GPUs. This would be quad.
But would this do the same thing as 4 cards?
Yes. If the GPUs in those 4 cards were effectively the same as these 2 GPUs, to a certain degree, yes, they should perform roughly the same. There's other elements that go in there, such as the power delivery
And the controllers.
And that sort of thing, and how much it's going to scale with the additional GPUs. But it's something I see a lot of the time. People will show a 4-way configuration. They'll say, oh, it's quad SLI or it's quad Crossfire. Quad is only 2 dual GPU cards next to each other. So that's just one of those naming conventions that I didn't always know, but I found out, and I try to point it out so people can be using the right terminology.
It reminds me of the dual CPUs used in the server motherboards.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's really all about how much power, how much performance you can get out of any given computing solution, and more is often better, although not always. And then again, these dual GPU cards are available from multiple different places. So AMD has theirs, of course, with the 7990, and there's a few other versions of that available. And then Asus has recently come out with this card, which is fairly unique. This one's unique to Asus. This is an NVIDIA card, which uses two of their GeForce GTX 760 GPUs. And the 760 was actually the same GPU that was used in the original 600 series 680, which was the highest card in the 600 series line. If I'm confusing you with all these numbers, I apologize.
No, so this is just a step above. Basically.
Yes, so this is a step above, and this is ASUS own design for integrating 2 of those 760 GPUs under the same card. And then again here on the bottom, you can sort of see the 2 bracket areas where those 2 GPUs live. And this is a way that you can get a dual GPU solution in a single card from NVIDIA. NVIDIA also has the GTX 690, which was NVIDIA's own design for 2 680s on the same card. We don't have one of those here to show you guys, for example, but we do have this dual GPU ASUS Mars 760 card. So that's another way that you can get 2 GPUs on the same card. But again, using more than one GPU is not always the best solution. It's going to vary depending on the games that you're playing. And then another thing is that the 7990 reference design from AMD, this 760 Mars is a completely custom design from ASUS. So ASUS took the GPUs and they designed the rest of the card around that. So that's another way that video card manufacturers can take the GPU manufacturer's product and sort of make their own product with it and make something that's a little bit special or a little bit different. But while we're talking about SLI and Crossfire configurations, I should mention the ways that you actually connect them when you set up. So for SLI, for example, you're going to have these little bridges. This is what's known as an SLI bridge, where you take 2 cards and connect them together. You have this little bridge, and you plug one side into each of the SLI fingers. That connects the cards and lets them talk together to play nice. If for NVIDIA, you also have a 3-way SLI bridge like this one. So this one's a rigid PCB, which again would connect across the top of 3 cards sitting next to each other. And then you have the Big Daddy 4-way SLI bridge, which connects across the top of 4 cards so that they can all talk together. When you're talking about SLI bridges, usually these will come with motherboards that are SLI compatible. And then for Crossfire, for the AMD side, they have a very similar little Crossfire bridge like this. It's a bit thicker, so you will notice these are not interchangeable with the SLI bridges from NVIDIA. And you can take these and string them one across the other down the cards to set up your Crossfire configurations for older AMD cards. AMD has actually taken a new tack with their 290 and 290X cards and eliminated the need for those bridges, so there's actually no connectors right there. For the newest AMD cards, they'll actually communicate with one another across the PCI Express bus because there's so much bandwidth available with Generation 3 that the AMD was like, well, we can just use that and we don't need to put a bridge across the top. So bear that in mind with older or basically 7000 series cards and prior, as well as the R9 and R7 series, except for the 290 and 290X, you will still have a Crossfire connector finger right there. So you'll need to connect that up to get your Crossfire solution up and running.
So I've noticed there's flexible and rigid.
Yes.
Does it pertain to one group like AMD or NVIDIA? I mean, or
I'm sure this exists, but I've actually only encountered these flexible bridges for Crossfire. Basically, you can do the same thing with this, or even with flexible SLI bridges that these bridges are accomplishing, simply by staggering them. 2 across the top one, the next one, you kind of go down it like that. So that's how I've always set up Crossfire. NVIDIA's partners are the only ones I've seen create these actual rigid PCB boards. Then one nice thing that I've noticed about these is I will actually use this 3-way bridge even for a 2-way configuration. Because it's rigid, it connects the cards and it makes it a bit more sturdy.
Oh, that's right,
so,
especially during transportation.
Yeah.
Well, you would have to transport it differently anyway.
I never recommend transporting a computer with a graphics card installed. I would always remove it and ship it separately, especially if you're shipping, because they're so heavy they can damage the motherboard if it's handled roughly or something like that.
But also for multi-card setups, it's also going to have more power draw. So
yes,
would you go over that for a little bit?
Yeah, so again, each of these cards is going to have what's known as a TDP, or thermal design power. TDP is basically a measurement in wattage of the amount of heat that the thermal solution or the heatsink and fan assembly here is supposed to be able to dissipate. So it's not necessarily how much wattage the GPU is going to draw, it's how much heat the thermal solution is going to dissipate. But you can still use that TDP as sort of a general idea of how much power you're going to draw. So for example, I did a 4-way R9 290X demonstration somewhat recently.
Wow.
And every new card that I added, since I was monitoring the wattage, my power draw from the wall jumped between 200 and 250 watts. So definitely something to consider if you're planning on expanding, or if you're building your computer and starting with a single graphics card, then you want to add more down the line. Make sure both your motherboard is going to support additional cards if that's what you want, and make sure your power supply has enough power to provide the juice to all those cards, because it can definitely be a power intensive, and it can get kind of warm running multiple cards. But honestly, I would only, unless you're an enthusiast or unless you really like to do testing and tinker and stuff, I would really only recommend 2-way configurations. Those are the most cost effective and the most performance effective. You'll find more games that support 2-way as opposed to 3-way and 4-way situations. So that's just my general advice to anyone who's looking into a really high-performing computer. 2-way is probably your best bet.
Okay, so would a 750 watt be enough?
That's a little bit too general, because it depends on what GPU you're talking about. Different GPUs are going to draw different powers. But usually, for instance, on the NVIDIA website, they'll often say, this is going to be your power supply recommendation for a single card. This will be your power supply recommendation for 2 cards, for example. Usually you'll see at least 1- and 2-way configurations for cards that support it as far as power recommendation.
Okay. One more thing about these is that what's important is length, right? I've noticed the ones with the dual GPUs, they're very long. So
yes.
What would you say it measures?
This card, I believe, is 11 inches, although it's been a while since I measured it. But yeah, that's definitely something to consider, is size when it comes to graphics cards, because depending on the case that you're using, if you're using a full tower case with tons and tons of space, you can probably fit any size card in there. But if you're going for a small form factor build, or if you're going for like a mini ITX motherboard, you want to make a little shoebox system, see how much length that your case supports for graphics cards, and make sure that your graphics cards will fit, basically. That's why whenever we do unboxing videos for graphics cards, we'll usually give them a quick measurement, just so we can say to you folks at home, make sure you have X amount of inches available in your space, so you can actually fit the graphics card in there.
So it feels like we have talked about just about everything about graphics cards, right?
Almost. I see
What are we
something
missing?
over on your left that we haven't discussed yet.
Ah, yes. Would you
the
like me
elephant in the
to
room.
move both of them over to you?
Sure, why not?
I'm so strong, I can hold both.
Oh, very nice. These are heavy too.
Yes, they
Okay,
are.
so what we're going to talk about next, and this is going to be really brief because this is an entire topic unto its own, is workstation graphics cards. Okay, so let me give you an example here of why workstation graphics cards are needed. Let's say you're playing a video game, and let's say you're going through that video game and you're seeing, say, 60 frames per second. That's what your graphics card is showing on your screen. So you're getting nice, smooth, fluid gameplay. Let's say suddenly there's an explosion or something like that. There's some big, complex thing that the graphics card needs to render all of a sudden, and there's a hiccup. Basically, your graphics cards needs to say, oh, hold on a second. It took me twice as long to render that one frame.
Ooh.
So what you see on the screen is what is sometimes known as a micro stutter, but basically it's a glitch.
It's like a white line?
It's like a ooh, and really if you're paying really close attention you might notice it, but chances are you won't. So in the context of you playing that game, how does that affect you?
I mean, would it be like lag at all? Like, 'cause that
It's,
would be...
I mean, to some extent, and various situations might introduce this more than others. But basically, the point I'm trying to make here is that for you playing a video game, if you have a single frame that had something wrong with it, whether it took longer to display on the screen or something like that, chances are 2 seconds later you've moved on, and that's you don't even notice it. Basically, for the most part, which is to say that these types of graphics cards out here, which are made for playing 3D games, are designed to work very quickly, and they're designed to have a certain amount of tolerance for problems that might occur along the GPU rendering pipeline. However, if you're doing something else, like let's say you're working on a big budget Hollywood film,
Yes.
Okay.
That's my other job.
Yes, that's what Joanne does in her spare time. And let's say you're rendering that, like a scene from that film, and what you render is going to be broadcast to millions of people all over the world or something like that. And let's say you have a frame that comes out with a bunch of artifacts in it or something like that. Wouldn't that be a bit bigger of a deal to you as a producer in that arena than would be somebody playing a game who sees a brief split second of a bad frame or something like that and moves on with their life?
Yes, but people will notice on the big screen.
People will notice on the big screen. So that was a fairly lengthy example of why workstation graphics cards are necessary. Okay, so the idea here is that workstation graphics cards might not necessarily have quite as high of a frequency that you'll see with the GPUs, for example, in desktop graphics cards. And they might be very expensive as well. Workstation graphics cards can often be very expensive, particularly compared to their desktop counterparts. But workstation graphics cards are designed to do a lot of rendering. They're designed to do it very, very accurately. And they're also designed by special teams. So NVIDIA and AMD both have their own teams that work with Quadro, which is NVIDIA's workstation graphics card solution. And then AMD has FirePro, which is their workstation graphics card solution, so FirePro and Quadro. NVIDIA, I should say, also has Tesla cards, which are headless, which you can add on for more processing power, but that's just kind of how they've arranged their lineup for the workstation. But basically, these cards are going to be more expensive, and if you tried to play a video game with these cards, they actually wouldn't do very well.
No.
But that's purely down to the drivers that they use. So the other thing that goes into the design and all the work that they go into bringing these cards out is actually software validation. So the Quadro and FirePro teams will work directly with the vendors who make these really, really high-end, really expensive enterprise-level bits of software, which I can't, for the life of me, remember an example of any right off the top of my head. But they're out there. They're used for 3D rendering. They're used for simulation, fluid dynamic simulations. They're often used actually in the health and science industries as well. We actually find a lot of universities will love to buy these types of cards because of the type of work that they do. But that I'm going to pretty much leave it at that as far as workstation graphics cards are concerned. They're more expensive, but they're designed to do a specific task, and they're designed to work smoothly and accurately with all the software that they're designed to function with. So we're going to leave it at that because otherwise I think it'll get too complicated.
One thing though, do they come with higher frame rates?
Not necessarily, because these cards are not designed for creating those high frame rates that the desktop graphics cards are. For those, you don't really care about a frame rate, because if you're rendering a movie, for example, it's just rendering each frame at a time, and it doesn't care how long it takes, because it's not worried about getting that frame displayed on the screen for somebody playing a game. It's worried about rendering that particular frame accurately with all of the effects or whatever that might have been integrated in with the software. Or if you're doing fluid dynamic simulations or something like that, it's designed to take all these simulated particles of water or something and make sure that as they're flowing over a subject or something like that, that they're flowing accurately to try to recreate what happens in real life. Another thing that they're often used for is advertisements. So often if you look at TV ads that are displayed and you see this perfect shot of like a shoe or something, and it's rotating around, and it looks like the coolest shoe you've ever seen, and it looks so realistic and lifelike, chances are that was actually a 3D model that was rendered with a workstation graphics card. But the reason it looks so nice is because those cards are designed to really go in depth, and it's a thing called ray tracing that's often used there, tracking the rays of light as it bounces off the different simulated sides of the thing and bounces around the room, and gives you that really really lifelike lighting situation. So workstation graphics cards. All right. They're cool.
So also one last thing is that Paul is going to be showing you how to install this card into a case. I mean, onto motherboard, all that good stuff. But first is, are we going to cover overclocking at all?
Not necessarily in this video. This is meant to be more of an entry-level video, but a good topic to at least address briefly, since I have talked about GPU speeds and frequencies. Overclocking is basically taking something and running it beyond the spec that the manufacturer has listed. I sometimes equate it to, let's say you have a car, and the car has a speedometer that's supposed to go up to 80. And you say, I want to go faster, so you drive the car faster. The manufacturer might have said, look, you're only supposed to go up to this speed. You might say, look, I think this car can go faster. There's pluses and minuses. You might drive faster, but the pieces of the car might start to fall off, something like that.
Ooh.
Which is not to say that overclocking is really a risky proposition when it comes to GPUs. Most of them have fail-safes built in so that you would have a hard time actually causing physical damage to your card. But since you are running it out of spec, it can affect your warranty, for example. And there's lots of different ways to do it, and it's actually easier to do than it ever has been with the software that's available both on the AMD and the NVIDIA side that you can use to tweak some of the overclocking parameters. And also, most of these cards that you can see here actually overclock themselves.
Whoa.
Right out of the box. So you'll often see a couple frequencies listed for any graphics card. When it comes, you'll see sort of a nominal speed that it will run at, and then when you load up a game and actually give it a bit more difficult task to do, it will ramp up to a higher frequency in order to handle that workload more efficiently, and then ramp itself back down to save power when it's not doing work.
So it's basically a smart overclocking.
Yes, and overclocking these days is basically changing those parameters so when it overclocks itself, it might overclock itself more.
Now that you know pretty much all the basics about discrete graphics cards as well as integrated graphics cards, why don't we go ahead and install this onto a motherboard?
Sounds good.
We're doing an installation of the GeForce GTX 760 card, and after that we're going to do a dual card setup, SLI style. So back to you, Paul.
That's right, Joanne, and fortunately for most users at home, installing a video card, I rank it second to memory as far as ease of installation. It's generally pretty simple, assuming, of course, that you've chosen the GPU that's compatible with your motherboard, PCI Express Gen 2 or Gen 3, and then make sure, of course, that your power supply has enough wattage for the graphics card, and that will almost always be listed on the graphics card's box or these specifications from the manufacturer. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is going to be power requirements. For this particular card, we have a couple extra power connectors. That is not universal, although for any mid-range to high-end graphics card, you're probably going to have at least one of these. I do have another example card right here, which is a more entry-level AMD card, and this one, for example, does not have any additional power plugs on it. So basically, you have 75 watts of available power through the PCI Express bus, and this card can run off of that. So not always necessary, but always double check to see that that's there. Apart from that, this PCI Express slot does have a notch in it, so you should be able to line that up with the PCI Express slot on your motherboard. And then apart from that, it should just be fairly obvious that the video outs are going to go at the back of the case. Now, speaking of case, this is not a case. This is an open-air test bed, so please bear that in mind. I have simulated what you would have in a case, which is some PCI Express bracket covers here at the back, which are usually held on by either thumb screws or regular screws. So you will, of course, want to remove the 1 or 2 or 3 of those that would be blocking where your graphics card is going to install. So there we go. And then apart from that, after, of course, properly grounding yourself by touching the metal of the case, or particularly the power supply if it's plugged into the wall, simply line up that PCI Express slot right there, as well as the 2 slots at the back of your case. Position it right above the PCI Express slot. Make sure it's going down right in line with that notch. And then you just need to push down firmly until it snaps into place. Most motherboards will have little latches like this one that you can see right here, and that one will actually pop up and lock it in when it drops down in there. If you're going to be removing a graphics card, this is an area where you can sometimes use this, although I would recommend perhaps a chopstick since it's not conductive. If you are using something metal, be very careful not to use too much pressure. And oh, I should also mention your computer should be turned off and the power supply also turned off while you're doing this. But to remove, simply line this up and you push that down, and that will unlock it, and then you can lift the card out. So maybe I should do that on my actual card just to show you how to remove it. That is unlocked, and then the card can be removed. There you go. It's as easy as that. So let me put the card back in, like so. Bear in mind that when it's just installed like this, it will be a little bit wobbly, so try not to put too much pressure on it. It is the securing it to the back bracket right here, which is really going to make sure that the card is nice and stable. And I always recommend doing this, particularly for permanent installations, because the back of the card right here is where you're going to be connecting your connectors, your video connectors for your monitor. And because of that, you're going to be often putting some pressure back here, wiggling those connectors around, trying to get them into place, or trying to tighten down the little screw caps on them so that they tighten down. So make sure those are nice and secure, and that will give you plenty of stability there at the back to make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on the graphics card. Apart from that, again, assuming that you have chosen a power supply, which is the proper wattage to supply power to the graphics card, all modern power supplies are going to include some of these types of connectors. These are PEG or PCI Express graphics connectors. And you'll be able to recognize this because they'll come in a block of 6, and then sometimes they'll have an additional block of 2 that you can add on. So 6-pin or 8-pin are the 2 configuration options there. And be very careful not to confuse these with supplemental CPU power connectors, which I have one of right over here, so I can unplug that. These are similar, but this one is keyed differently, and that's also a block of 8. So you can wedge these in accidentally, but just bear in mind the CPU supplemental connector will be either a block of 8 or 4+4. The PCI Express graphics will be 6 or 6+2.
Also, I've seen some of the PCIe connectors, they are in different colors.
Yes.
Like sometimes blue, sometimes red, just so you do not get them confused.
Yeah, so there's, I don't think there's any standard for the color for the PCI Express graphics connectors, but generally speaking, you'll have some sort of label, like you can see down here on here, indicating specifically these are PCI Express.
Or on the connectors themselves.
Sometimes it's on the block itself. Now, as far as plugging these in, again, it should be fairly simple. You'll notice that it has a little latch on one side that helps lock it in once it's installed, and on the card itself, right under here, there's actually a latch facing on that side. Or alternatively, actually here I can show you on this card to give you guys a better look. So you might notice right in here, there's a little catch that's going to plug into. And then alternatively, if I was trying to plug this in that way, for example, that latch would be up on top and it'd be blocked by the PCB. So there's really only one way to plug these in effectively. So again, this card just uses 2 6-pin. So simply like that and like that. And then the power is connected. Then of course you want to do your cable management and whatnot. But that will give the supplemental power as well as the power from the PCI Express slot. And that will make sure that your video card's up and running. Apart from that, just plug in your monitor and you're pretty much good to go. Boot on your computer and then look up the drivers for your graphics card. For NVIDIA drivers, I recommend just going directly to the NVIDIA site, and the same with AMD, just go directly to the AMD site to download the latest drivers, because getting new drivers can often improve your performance. Now we're going to add another graphics card. So since we mentioned we can use 2 graphics cards in a 2-way configuration, so this is a 2-way SLI demonstration as opposed to a 2-way Crossfire demonstration if we were installing AMD cards. These are the same card. These are both GTX 760s, but this is a PNY one, so you can see they've just gone with a slightly different design for the shroud over the cooling solution. Now another thing about graphics cards, especially if you're going to do a 2-way configuration, I like to provide spacing between the cards if possible. These cards do get very warm, so in this particular board, this board can actually do up to 4 graphics cards, in which case 4 dual slot cards, they'd be really right up against each other. But since this is just a 2-way configuration, I'm going to go with this slot right here, which is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th slot. And that will provide 2 more slots of spacing in between the 2 cards. Also, it just so happens that on the motherboard, this is a full-length X16 slot, and also the slot that I plugged it into, the first card into, was also a full-length X16 slot. So again, same solution, just drop it in until it snaps into place. I will then secure the card at the back with my thumb screws. Since they're thumb screws, I'm using a screwdriver, because I'm contrary, I suppose. And 1.
It's just faster.
It is faster, that's true. 1 and 2 like so, and the card is secured. There we go. And then apart from the power connectors, which of course we will need to plug in a couple more into this card as well, we have, of course, the SLI bridge. So in this case,
I'm so
what?
sorry.
Did I forget something?
Oh, no. Go for it.
Oh, okay. Joanne looked at me. Like I
was
did something
mistaken.
wrong. Okay, so here's the SLI bridge. Now, I could use this very easily and just drop that in between these two cards like that, and then I would be good to go. But I'm going to do something a little special with this one. Again, this is just based on your personal preference, so this is not necessary. This will work just fine, and in case you're wondering, you can use either of these SLI fingers to connect that to, although I generally recommend going for your first card with the one closest to the video outs. But in this case, just because I have this available, I'm actually going to use this three-way SLI bridge right over them like this. Because again, I like to do this just if I have it available, because it's going to do the same effect. It's going to connect these two cards. It doesn't matter that there's not one in the middle. And it will hold the cards much more stably, so you might get a little bit less droopage in the slot or whatever over time. Apart from the SLI bridge being installed, of course, one more set of power connectors for this guy. 1 and 2. And then we are all set to go.
Yay! Exciting.
We have
so
set
exciting.
up two-way SLI with NVIDIA GeForce GTX 760s.
All right, that wraps it up for this video card category video. And we hope that even if you are new to graphics cards or are a seasoned veteran, you have found this video somewhat helpful to you. So thank you, Paul, for giving us a very in-depth look at all of these cards and their various uses.
Of course, anytime, and thanks to all you guys for watching.
So if you enjoyed this video, we hope that you will subscribe, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching Newegg TV.